let's get right into the video. She tried to stay quiet, she really did. But after 8 years of keeping a heavy secret, the day came when Elaine Fleischman couldn't take it anymore. Quote, "It was like watching an old lady get mugged on the street," she says. "I thought I can't sit by any longer," end quote. Elaine is a tall, thin, quick-witted securities lawyer in her late 30s with long blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and an infectious sense of humor that has survived some very tough times. She has had to struggle to find work despite some striking skills and qualifications, a common symptom of a not-so-common condition called being a whistleblower. Elaine is a central witness in one of the biggest cases of white-collar crime in American history, possessing secrets that J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon late last year paid $9 billion, not $13 billion, as regularly reported. More on that later. To keep from the public hearing. Back in 2006, as a deal manager at that gigantic bank, Elaine first witnessed and tried to stop what she describes as a, quote, massive criminal securities fraud in the bank's mortgage operations. Thanks to confidentiality agreement, she's kept her mouth shut since then. My closest family and friends don't know what I've been living with, end quote, she says. Quote, "Even my brother will only find out for the first time when he sees this interview," end quote. 6 years after the crisis that cratered the global economy, is not exactly news that the country's biggest banks stole on a grand scale. That's why the more important part of Elaine's story is in the pains Chase and the Justice Department took to silence her. She was blocked at every turn by asleep on-the-job regulators like the SEC, by a court system that allowed Chase to use its billions to bury her evidence, and finally by officials like outgoing Attorney General Eric Holder, the chief architect and crazily elaborate government policy of surrender and cover-up. Every time I had a chance to talk, something always got in the way, Elaine says. This past year, she's watched as Holder's Justice Department struck a series of historical settlement deals with Chase, Citigroup, and Bank of America. The root bargain in these deals was cash for secrecy. The banks paid big fines without trials or even judges. Only secret negotiations that typically ended with the public shown nothing but vague, quasi-official papers like statement of facts, which were completely devoid of anything like actual facts. And now, with Holder about to leave office and his Justice Department reportedly wrapping up its final settlements, the state is effectively putting the finishing touches on what will amount to a sweeping industry-wide effort to bury the facts of a whole generation of Wall Street corruption. "I could be sued into bankruptcy," she says. "I could lose my license to practice law. I could lose everything, but if we don't start speaking up, then this is really all we're going to get. The biggest financial cover-up in history." Elaine grew up in Terrace, British Columbia, a snowbound valley town just a brisk 18-hour drive north of Vancouver. She excelled at school from a young age, making her way to Cornell Law and then on to Wall Street. Her decision to go into finance surprised those closest to her, as she has always had more idealistic ambitions. She is quoted saying, "I helped lead a group that wrote briefs to the Human Rights Chamber for those passion for securities law and felt strongly she was doing a good thing. There was nothing shady about the field back then, she says. It's very respectable. In 2006, after a few years at a white shoe law firm, Elaine ended up at Chase. The mortgage market was white hot. Banks like Chase, Bank of America, and Citigroup were furiously buying up huge pools of home loans and repackaging them as mortgage securities. Like soybeans and processed food, then since these synthesized financial products wound up in everything, whether you knew it or not. Your state's pension fund, another state's workers' compensation fund, maybe even the portfolio of the insurance company you were counting on to support your family if you got hit by a bus. As a transaction manager, Elaine functioned as a kind of quality control officer. Her main job was to help make sure the bank didn't buy spoiled merchandise before it got tossed into the meat grinder and sold out the other end. A few months into her tenure, Elaine would later testify in a DOJ deposition. The bank hired a new manager for diligence, the group in charge of reviewing and clearing loans. Elaine Fleischman quickly ran into a problem with this manager, technically one of her superiors. She says he told the other employees to stop sending him emails. The department, it seemed, was wary of putting anything in writing when it came to its mortgage deals. If you sent him an email, he would actually come out and yell at you, she says. The whole point of having a compliance intelligence group is to have policies that are set out clearly in writing, so to have exactly the opposite of that was very worrisome. One former high-ranking federal prosecutor said that if he were taking a criminal case to the trial, the information about this email policy would be crucial. I would begin and end my opening statement with that. He says it shows these people knew what they were doing and were trying not to get caught. In late 2006, not long after the no email policy was implemented, Fleischman and her group were asked to evaluate a packet of home loans from a mortgage originator called Greenpoint that was collectively worth $900 million. Almost immediately, Fleischman and some of the diligence managers who worked alongside her began to notice serious problems with this particular package of loans. For one thing, the dates on many of them were suspiciously old. Normally, banks tried to turn loans into securities at warp speed. The idea was to go from a homeowner signing on the dotted line to an investor buying that loan in a pool of securities within 2 to 3 months. Thus, it was a huge red flag to see Chase buying loans that were allegedly 7 or 8 months old. What this meant was that many of the loans in Greenpoint deal had either been previously rejected by Chase or another bank, or were what are known as early payment defaults, EPDs, or loans that have already been sold to another bank and have been returned after the borrowers missed multiple payments. That's why the dates on them were so old. In other words, this was the very bottom of the mortgage barrel. They were like used cars that had been towed back to the lot after throwing a rod. The industry had its own term for this sort of loan product, scratch and dent, as Chase later admitted. Is not only ended up reselling hundreds of millions of dollars worth of those crappy loans to investors, it also sold them in a mortgage pool marketed as being above subprime, a type of loan called Alt-A. Putting a scratch and dent loans in an Alt-A security is like putting a fresh coat of paint on a bunch of junkyard wrecks and selling them as new cars. Quote, everything that I thought was bad at the time, end quote, Fleischman says, turned out 90% of them were based on overstated incomes, an astronomically high defect rate for any pool of mortgages. Chase's normal tolerance for error was 5%. One mortgage in particular that sticks out in Elaine's mind involved a manicurist who claimed to have an annual income of $117,000. Fleischman figured that even working 7 days a week, this woman would need to work 488 days a year to make that much. And that's with no overhead. Fleischman says it wasn't possible. But when she and others raised objections to toxic loans, something odd started happening. The number of crunchers who had been complaining about the loans suddenly began changing their reports. The process she describes is strikingly similar to the way police obtain false confessions. The interrogator verbally abuses a target until he starts producing the desired answers. What happened, Elaine says, is, quote, Elaine says the head diligence manager started yelling at his team, berating them, making them to do reports over and over, keeping them late at night, end quote. Then the loan started clearing. As a late December 11, 2006, diligence managers had marked a full 33% off one loan sample as stated income unreasonable for profession, meaning that it was nearly inevitable that there would be a high number of defaults. Several high-ranking executives were copied on this report. Then, on December 15th, a Chase sales executive held a lengthy meeting with reps from Greenpoint and the diligence team to examine the remaining loans in the pool. When they got to the manicurist, Fleischman remembers, one of the diligence guys finally caved under the pressure from the sales executive. He had his hands up and just said, okay, and he cleared it, says Fleischman, adding that he was shaking his head no, even as he was saying yes. Soon afterward, the error rate in the pool had magically dropped below 10%, a threshold that itself had just been doubled to clear the way for this deal. After that meeting, Elaine testified she approached a managing director named Greg Poster and pleaded with him to reconsider. She says she told Poster that the bank could not sell high-risk loans as low-risk securities without committing fraud. Quote, you can't securitize these loans without special disclosure about what's wrong with them, Fleischman told him. And if you make that disclosure, no one will buy them, end quote. A former Olympic ski jumper, Poster was such an important executive at Chase that when he later defected to the Chicago-based hedge fund Citadel Diamond cut off trading with Citadel in retaliation, Poster eventually returned to Chase and is still there today despite his role in this affair. This moment illustrates that the most basic element of the case against Chase, the bank knowingly peddled products stuffed with scratch and dent loans to investors without disclosing the obvious defects with the underlying loans. Years later, in its settlement with the Justice Department, Chase would admit that this conversation between Elaine and Poster took place, though neither was named. It was simply described as an employee told a managing director and that her warning was ignored when the bank sold off these loans to investors. A few weeks later, in early 2007, she sent a long letter to another managing director, William Buell. In the letter, she warned Buell of the consequences of reselling these bad loans as securities and gave detailed descriptions of breakdowns in Chase's diligence process. Elaine assumed this letter, which Chase's lawyers would later jokingly nickname the Howler. After screaming a missive from the Harry Potter books would be enough to force the bank to stop selling the bad loans, it used to be just didn't know at the time. In February 2008, less than 2 years after joining the bank, Bellagement quietly dismissed it. In a round of layoffs a few months later, proof would appear that her bosses knew all along that the boom-era mortgage market was rotten. That September, as the market was crashing, Diamond posted in Paul Washington Fortune article titled Jamie Dimon's SWAT Team that he knew well before the meltdown that the subprime market was toast. We concluded that underwriting standards were deteriorating across the industry. The story tells of Diamond ordering Poster's boss William King to dump the bank's subprime holdings in October 2006. Quote, Billy Diamond says, quote, we need to sell a lot of our positions. This stuff could go up in smoke, end quote. In other words, 2 full months before the bank rammed through the dirty Greenpoint deal over Bellagioment's objections, Chase's CEO was aware that the loans like this were too dangerous for Chase itself to own. Though Diamond was talking about subprime loans and Greenpoint was technically an Alt-A pool, the Fortune story shows that upper management had serious concerns about industry-wide underwriting problems. In January 2010, when Diamond testified before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, he told investigators the exact opposite story, portraying the poor Chase leadership as having duped just like the rest of us in mortgage underwriting. He says, somehow we just missed it, that home prices don't go up forever, end quote. When Elaine found out about all this years later, she was shocked. Her confidentiality agreement Chase didn't bar her from reporting a crime, but the problem was that she couldn't prove that Chase had committed a crime without knowing whether those bad loans had been sold. As it turned out, of course, Chase was selling those rotten dog meat loans all over the place. How bad were they? A single suit by a single angry litigant gives, some men say. In 2011, Chase was sued over massive losses suffered by a group of credit unions. One of them had invested $135 million in one of the bank's mortgage-backed securities. About 40% of the loans in that deal came from Greenpoint Pool. The lawsuit alleged that in just the first year, the security suffered $51 million in losses, nearly 50 times what had been projected. It's hard to say how much of that was due to Greenpoint loans, but this was just one security 1 year, and the losses were in the tens of millions. And Chase did deal after deal with the same methodology. So did most of the other banks. It's theft on a scale that blows the mind. In spring of 2012, Elaine, who moved back to Canada after leaving Chase, was working at a law firm in Calgary when the phone rang. It was an investigator from the States. Quote, hi, I'm from the SEC. You weren't expecting to hear from me, were you? End quote. A few months earlier, President Obama, giving in to pressure from the Occupy movement and other reformers, had formed the Residential Mortgage-Backed Securities Working Group. At least superficially, this was a serious show of force against the banks like Chase. The group would operate like a kind of regulatory justice league, combining the superpowers of investigators from the SEC, FBI, IRS, HUD, and a host of other federal agencies. It included noted anti-corruption investigator and New York attorney Eric Schneiderman, which gave many observers reason to hope that finally something would be done about the crimes that led to the crash. That makes the fact that the bank would skate with negligible cash fines an even more extraordinary accomplishment. By the time the working group was set, most of the applicable statutes and limitations had either expired or were about to expire. A conspiratorial say that the state waited far too long to look at these cases and is now taking its sweet time investigating, while the last statutes of limitations ran out, says famed prosecutor and former New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer. It soon became clear that the SEC wasn't so much investigating Chase's behavior as just checking boxes. Elaine received no follow-up phone calls, even though she told the investigator that she was willing to tell the SEC everything she knew about the systematic fraud at Chase. Instead, the SEC focused on a single transaction involving a mortgage company called WMC. Quote, I kept trying to talk about Greenpoint, but they just wanted to talk about that other deal. End quote, Elaine says. The following year, the SEC would fine Chase $297 million for misrepresentations in the WMC deal. On the surface, it looked like a hefty punishment. In reality, it was a classic example of the piecemeal cherry-picking style of justice that characterized the post-crisis era. The kid gloves approach, quote, the kid gloves approach that the DOJ and the SEC take with Wall Street is inexplicable and is indefensible, end quote, says Dennis Keller of financial reform group Better Markets, which would later file a suit challenging the Chase settlement. They typically charge only one offense when there are dozens. It would be like charging a serial murderer with a single assault and giving them probation. Damn. Soon Elaine's hopes were raised again. In late 2012 and early 2013, she had a pair of interviews with civil litigators from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of California, based in Sacramento. One of the ongoing myths about the financial crisis is that government is so matched by the legal talent representing the banks. But Elaine was impressed by the lead attorney in her case, a litigator named Richard Elias. Quote, he sounded like he had been a securities lawyer for 10 years. This actually looked like his idea of fun, like he couldn't wait to run with this case, end quote, says Elaine. She gave Elias and his team detailed information about everything she'd seen, the edict against emails, the sabotaging of diligence process, the bullying, the written warnings that were ignored, all of it. She assumed that it would be long before the bank was hauled into court. Instead, the government decided to help Chase bury the evidence. It began when Holder's office scheduled a press conference for the morning of September 24th, 2013 to announce sweeping civil fraud charges against the bank, and all laid out in a detailed complaint drafted by the U.S. Attorney's Sacramento office. But that morning the presser was suddenly canceled and no complaint was filed. According to later reports of the news, Diamond had personally called the assistant attorney Associate Attorney General Tony West, the third ranking official in the Justice Department, and asked to reopen negotiations to settle the case out of court. It goes without saying that the ordinary citizen who is the target of a government investigation cannot simply pick up the phone, call up the prosecutor in charge of his case, and have a legal proceeding canceled. But Diamond did just that, and he didn't just call the prosecutor. He called the prosecutor's boss, Elaine says, according to the New York Times. After Diamond had already offered $3 billion to settle the case and was turned down, he went to Holder's office and upped the offer, but apparently not by enough. A few days later, Elaine, who had then moved back to Vancouver and was looking for work, was at a mall when she saw a Wall Street Journal headline on her iPhone. J.P. Morgan insider helps U.S. in probe. The story said that the government had a key witness, a female willing to provide damaging testimony about Chase's mortgage operations. Elaine was stunned. Until that moment, she had no idea that she was a major part of the government's case against Chase. course, nobody had bothered to warn her that she was about to be effectively outed in the newspapers. The stress started to build after I saw that news, she says, especially as I waited to see if my name would come out and I watched my job possibilities evaporate. Elaine later realized that the government wasn't interested in having her testify against Jason in court or any other public forum. Instead, the Justice Department's political wing, led by Holder, appeared to be using her and her evidence as a bargaining chip to extract more hush money from Diamond. It worked. Within weeks, Diamond had upped his offer to roughly $9 billion. In late November, two sides agreed on a settlement deal that covered a variety of misbehaviors, including the fraud that Elaine witnessed, as well as similar episodes at Washington Mutual and Bear Stearns, two companies that Chase had acquired during this crisis. The newspaper and the Justice Department described the deal as a $13 billion settlement, hailing it as the biggest white-collar regulatory settlement in American history. The deal released Chase from civil liability, and in what was described by the New York Times as a major victory for the government, it left open the possibility that the Justice Department could pursue a further criminal investigation against the bank. But the idea that Holder had cracked down on Chase was carefully contrived fiction, one that has survived to this day. For starters, $4 billion of that settlement was largely in accounting falsehood, a chunk of bogus consumer relief added to make the payoff look bigger. What the public never grasped about these consumer relief deals is that the relief is often not paid by the bank, which mostly just services the loans, but by the bank's other victims, investors. Example is like investors in their bad mortgage securities. Moreover, in this case, a fine print indicated that this consumer relief would be allowed only if said investors agreed to it, or if it would have been granted anyway under existing arrangements. This often comes down to either giving a small portion of a loan or giving homeowners a little extra time to pay up in full. It's not real, says Elaine. They structured it so that the homeowners only get relief if they would have gotten it anyway. She pauses. If a loan shark gives you an extra few weeks to pay up, is that consumer relief? The average person had no way of knowing what a terrible deal the Chase settlement was for the country. The terms were even lighter than the slap on the wrist formula that allowed Wall Street banks to neither admit nor deny any wrongdoing. The deals that helped spark the Occupy had helped spark the Occupy protests, yet these notorious deals were like Nuremberg hangings compared to the regulatory innovation that Holder's Justice Department cooked up for Diamond and Company. Instead of a detailed compliant naming names, Chase was allowed to sign a flimsy 10.5-page statement of facts that was so short a first-year law student could read it in the time it takes to eat a tuna sandwich and be so vague. A halfway intelligent person could read it and not know anyone had done anything wrong. The ink was barely dry on the deal before Chase would have the balls to insinuate its innocence.